So another day has come for our wonderful time together on this podcast. But Tim, I'm a little uncertain as to what we're going to be talking about today.
I don't know either. I think we have a probability here, but we don't have a real good idea. What would you like to talk about?
Well, the one thing about IT people is we're not very good at the jokes, are we? So our conversation today is on uncertainty. How's that?
That's good. That's good. So what do you want to talk about with uncertainty?
Well, let me start off with a vignette that I think kind of fits here. We were in the process, myself and my team, we were hired on as oversight and advisors to a organization. And one of the things we had to do was get a request for proposal out the door. It was for a government organization and it was for a human services contract. Now, here's what's interesting. Right in the middle of what we were doing, just before we were about to release the request for proposal to the vendor community, the federal government put out warning of legislation to come, which we affectionately in this country know as Obamacare. Now, Obamacare changed the rules significantly for the program that we were automating, but at that point, that no one knew what those rules would be. Yet we had to get this request for proposal out the door. So we were left with, and I'm not going to say ambiguity because we knew something was coming.
Mhm.
There was risk, but certainly there was uncertainty because we had no idea what the new rules were going to be. I think they were still being promulgated, as a matter of fact. So that probably was the one situation. Several times I've been in uncertain situations, but that was probably the one that comes to mind where we purposely continued on the project knowing the unknown was coming.
Yeah. Another one that you're familiar with and we've talked about that impacted me a lot was year 2K.
Oh
We knew
yeah.
it was going to happen, but we didn't know whether the whole world was going to shut down or we were just going to have to reset our calendars or what was going to happen. And how do you wrap your head around that? And how do you plan for things that basically don't have things to plan? You don't have the context.
Well, you don't. I guess at Y2K, year 2000, we knew a little bit more perhaps in terms of the fact that we had some old code that wouldn't work once that calendar flipped over. So there was less uncertainty, but the contracts that I was on at the time, we didn't know how bad it was. So there was that part of the uncertainty.
So you're highlighting something about uncertainty, but let's start opening this up and look at it from a more general standpoint. And when we say uncertainty, are we just talking about risk?
No, I think for me, maybe we'll get into this a little bit later as well. For me, risk happens anyway. Uncertainty may be um, what would I say, influences on risk. But I think when we talk about certainty, it truly is the unknown. And by the way, maybe we should stop here for 1 second and say that in the project management body of knowledge that PMI has put out, uncertainty is the eighth of eight domains. So it's not like we're talking about some concept that no one has ever come up with. This is truly a domain within the PMBOK 7. So um, I'm not sure I answered that question. How would you answer your own question now, Tim?
Well, that's interesting because as a domain, it's defined specifically as risk and uncertainty.
Oh,
Because we have within risk an attribute called probability, and that's less than 100% chance of occurring in the future. So that's the uncertainty component. And like you said, Obamacare was a certainty. Year 2000, we only had reserved so many spaces for calendar and timing. That's the certainty. We just didn't know what was going to happen after. And that was the uncertainty. Uncertainty is lack of something in order to be able to predict to a high level of probability what an outcome is going to be. That's the best I can get.
Yeah, and I do remember reading that, and I thought, why are we talking about uncertainty as a domain when really, if you read through the whole process, you ended up talking a lot about risk appetite, about the five qualifications of how you handle or mitigate risk, and also about opportunities, because risk can result in opportunity, not just in threats.
So
So,
yeah, and I don't want to get into this too much because I
no,
think as we explore this further, there's other words that they use that are associated with uncertainty. Ambiguity.
ambiguity, yeah, complexity,
Ambiguity is one of them.
yeah.
And what was another word you
I
said?
think complexity. I remember reading about
Yeah.
volatility, although that volatility, to me, those are always there, I guess, when we do IT projects. And can I offer this? Is that I spent most of my career doing in a for-profit situation where we bid fixed fee, well, fixed price, not just fixed fee, fixed price and fixed schedule. So talk about uncertainty going into those situations when sometimes all you had was 300 pages of a request for proposal to go through before you bid on that situation.
Yeah,
So
and you'd think that that level of documentation would minimize the risk. No, it doesn't. The problem is the more documentation you have, the more information it exposes and the more risk that it exposes. That's what always blew me away compared to the two documents, 130, 300 pages. You're going to find more risk in a 300-page document. This is a bit of a head scratcher.
well, and what's amazing to me too is often when we went into that, and they often had a bidders library as well, which had documentation that supplanted the request for proposal. And sometimes we found a lot of ambiguity in those documents. So it wasn't that interesting, adding to the uncertainty and to the risk of that bid.
Right, 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 right,
But
right.
here's what's interesting. I want to tell you how we got around that. Was we literally, before we ever put our proposal into place, and this may fit later on into our discussion, but before we ever put that proposal into the organization, we did a lot of data gathering. We did a lot of hall walking and conversations as long as we were allowed to before they cut that off for the bidders. But we made sure that we understood those areas of uncertainty so that we could mitigate them for ourselves by putting in a lot of assumptions and constraints into the bid process itself to, well, not only to alert the customer that we knew there was areas that they weren't even sure about, but also to protect both of us and the customer from what could happen in that uncertain area.
Very good. Very good. Now, you can't capture it all.
You
And in
cannot.
fact, you can just identify a certain set, and there are going to be unplanned events. But let's take that off the table. Let's just talk about uncertainty that we have a process for potentially identifying here. Let's also do one other thing for our discussion here today. You're talking about uncertainty under contract,
Yeah.
which is highly, highly, highly constrained, especially when you have a fixed fee or a lump sum contract. That means that you have to account for all potential risk in the price up front, and that's agreed upon to the buyer and seller. Do you think that can ever be rather accurate, or is that going to have to be a little bit flexible?
Well, it has to be a little bit flexible, and we can talk about this a little bit later as well. But not only in that flexibility, I think we got good enough at it that we could understand the underlying thought processes of the customer who was putting out the bid, such that by putting in our assumptions and constraints and making them part of the bid, therefore becoming part of the contract, we did protect ourselves as well as our customer from unplanned situations that could occur.
So here we are. We're trying to identify as clearly as possible. Let's look at under contract risk. Um, how do you go about basically setting aside enough time and money in your estimates to account for these events that may or may not happen? How do you do the assessment and the reserve analysis?
The first thing we did was if we were totally unfamiliar with the domain itself, the functional domain, we probably would pass on that. Now, if we were in situations where we were more familiar with the domain or where we had experts that we could bring in, we did a lot of data gathering up front. We did a lot of brainstorming in rooms that sometimes went till midnight or past 2 o'clock in the morning, brainstorming situations. If this happens, what then? And a lot of times also, as we put out our reasoning for going ahead with the bid, we would have to present that to senior management and let them have a go at it. And they would ask very, very good questions that we either answered and therefore went forward, or couldn't answer and therefore did not go forward. So there was a lot of upfront analysis, data gathering, hall walking, just so that we could understand both the functionality that we were supposed to implement, as well as the mindset of the client themselves, who we would be working with for the next several months or years.
Let me give you an example of what I experienced too, under contract, that is. Okay, we'll talk about what it looks like internal to a corporation. But under contract, a lot of my work was innovative, like never been done before. They had a problem that nobody on the planet had ever solved.
That's tough.
Yeah, I was working with people who ran the hardware and software for the stock exchanges around the planet. I was working with people who were trying to figure out a new way of running uh, the calculations for the pharmaceutical trials. And so we used a lot of your old friends' constraints and assumptions, and we bounded those things as much. So we eliminated that risk through agreement in the contract. And that was the only way we could approach this.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You mentioned the internal IT shop. In some ways, that should be easier. Now, I've never worked at an internal IT shop, but I've worked with IT shops that were internal to the customer we were serving. And in many ways, it should be easier because you should, as an IT shop, be able to embed yourself in the business of those you're serving.
You'd think.
Yeah.
Actually, it was to a great extent. The problem is people have a bias around indirect costs because they're not spending it and they don't see it as an impact to themselves. Let's
Yeah.
just play with this and let's see what happens. And if there's something that happens, we'll just throw more money and people at it. It's not my money.
Whether you're coming at it from a contracting point of view or from an internal IT shop point of view, it really does come down to the money and the ability and the skill level of your practitioners.
And also, as we have grown inside with our corporations as they got more mature, and as corporations learned how to approach work with newer and newer technology, this sense of urgency has been a major call to action for people to say, okay, let's sacrifice things to get things done early. And a lot of it has. We don't have time to think about risk. Let's just get the work done. So a combination of factors have allowed, I'm not going to say this in this way, but has allowed project management, not necessarily the people, but project management itself, to become lazy and not do the diligence required to really understand risk as it would occur under contract. That's my experience, that is.
Yeah, there is some of that. I think in some organizations where the impetus is to stay abreast of or get ahead of their customers, I think in those situations, the automation of systems has to be paramount. And so in those kinds of situations, they do really need to do that due diligence to not only understand their competition, but also get those systems out fast. And from a project management point of view, maybe you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of brainstorming, but you certainly need to be on your game as far as getting that implementation out the door.
Yeah, and at the same time, you still have to have that ongoing conversation.
You do.
You still have to say, look, there's a lot of risk we're not exploring,
Yes.
and there are unplanned risks that we're not aware of. And let's have an active discussion and understand there may be something that could happen, and we can't even estimate it, but that something out there is maybe a showstopper or may slow us down. And we have to agree that life and the laws of physics just dictate that this is part of the way we do our work.
Well, and the example that I provided earlier in terms of a contracting agency doing their due diligence, if it so happened that we could not uncover what we needed to, or as you just explained, that there's some showstoppers out there because we have not been able to do our due diligence, we had the opportunity just to do a no bid. But if you're an internal IT shop and the CEO and the CIO say we're going to do this, you don't have a lot of choice.
And I observed this working from 2000 through 2007 as a consultant. Every corporation was facing this. And remember, 2001 is when you have the Agile Alliance gathering. And it's really interesting because you have people who were product developers and people who were software developers talking to each other. And they were looking at the fact that, number one, this helps us be fast and flexible with things we don't know or surprises which are either happy or bad surprises. And number two, it gives us some type of framework to work in a confident manner to talk about these assumptions regularly and these constraints and be able to make these experiments very quickly in order to clarify those things. So I see Agile as a response not just to the we don't have any work history, but uncertainty itself.
So can I throw a little bit of a monkey wrench in here?
Sure.
So we've done all of our due diligence, whether I'm the contractor or the internal IT shop. I like what you just said about how Agile came about almost as a necessity. So we really come in prepared. We've got this thing nailed. And something out of the blue hits, like an economic downturn, or what we just went through with COVID, with the pandemic, or there's so many factors that can truly upset all of our best laid plans and due diligence. Where do we go from there?
Well, first of all, when you have a major project, and you've probably had this too, there has to be a discussion for some type of security set aside for planned risk or uncertainty. And there has to be some discussion about some security or plan for unplanned things and unplanned risk. And when we talk about this, and this is not agile or predictive projects, this is just projects in general.
Yes.
You have to have something called management reserve. And this is a formal discussion that project managers, as they're planning these critical projects, have to have in place.
Yeah, and I think, for example, let's take COVID as an example. I think that caught a lot of projects flat-footed. Now, one of the protections that we have both as customer and vendor in contracting situations was there's often a force majeure clause in the contracts. So if something is truly devastating, then there is a way to extricate yourself without financial penalties on both sides.
Yeah,
But
there's another mechanism too. It's called insurance.
insurance, yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
there's liability insurance, which
Yeah.
says if we do something that upsets the operations and it of our client, and it hurts their revenue stream, they have the right to come back and ask for a replacement of that revenue through insurance. And then we have errors and omissions insurance, where we don't build it correctly to the specifications. I've seen this a lot in my telecommunications work, where you have cell towers or operating centers who handle like emergency services or handle government channels through the cell towers or central switches, right? And the federal government has talked to telephone providers and said, if they're down for a certain amount of time, guess what? We're going to fine you. Well,
Yeah.
if we're working for our clients, the telephone providers, they're going to ask us to carry that insurance. And that is a form of management reserve that projects can rely on.
Yeah, and that's almost looking forward to something. You get a bad winter storm that knocks down the ability to serve for a while, right? So in those situations, I can see that. But if you truly have some devastating situation that you could not have even insured against because it's no one's fault, then you have these other.
Well, and that's where this gets really interesting with COVID and with lockdowns and other these environmental factors, like in the 19 when was it, in the early 1980s, when we had a volcano go off in Washington state. And these things, it's like there's no way to protect a company,
That's right. Yeah.
much less a project, from these things. It's basically resilience and recovery that you're looking at from that point. And they're I hate to say it, they're basically figuring out as they respond to these things that have occurred.
Well, because business must go on, right? So,
Right.
so let me ask you this though: how early, or if you remember back early in your career, do you remember anything like this happening? And that you had to protect against or that you had to work around. It's because uncertainty happens, but
I worked for a transportation company in the early to mid 1990s, and they had union drivers of the packages, and the union struck. All of the IT projects were ground to a halt, and we were repurposed to help clean out the warehouses. We didn't take any new packages because that was part of the negotiation between the union and the company. But we had to clean out all the warehouses of the packages that were in the system. So for 2 weeks, we were trained and certified to put our projects away, pack them in styrofoam per se, and then do that. And as soon as the negotiations were going on, we could get back to work. Now, luckily, the company at that point was almost 80 years old, so it had gone through this 3 times. And so they had the processes and they had the insurance and they had the experience to do this quite effectively. We were just lucky in that situation. It was almost an identified risk, but still, it was not a risk that you could predict.
yeah, I think I found early in my career, and this shows how old I am. Early in my career, I think our IT projects were not nearly as complex as they are now.
I agree with you.
And, and so there
I
was there was probably less uncertainty because there was less complexity. And the other thing that I recall, our user community was not as sophisticated as they are now.
Right.
Not to say they didn't do their jobs as well. Functionally, they were equally as sophisticated. But from an IT perspective, which was fairly new, they didn't really know how to ask the questions or how to really get involved. And we as IT professionals didn't really know how to ask them their questions and get them involved. So often we just ended up automating functions that they were already doing manually. So we did manual functions faster, basically.
Exactly. And the expectation was really low too.
Yeah.
Computers were green screen, so you didn't have to worry about graphics or ease of use. It was understood that IT was going to be a little bit clunky. So there wasn't a big expectation of we're going to basically impact we're going to impact the operations in a negative way. Yes, we are. We're touching the heartbeat of the operations, but they experience that by designing the business processes themselves. And IT as a factor of that was expected to be just as disruptive. And I think now, because of the ease of use that is, number one, built into our systems, and number two, is expected of our systems, I think we have a higher perception of what we mean is what we're willing to accept. That's our threshold discussion that we have. And the tolerance and threshold, I think, is a lot lower than it has been in the past.
And the RFPs, or requests for proposals, that I worked on or responded to, they often had a section in the requirements detailing pages of ease of use requirements. So yeah, we had to be on top of that. And I think from a complexity point of view and an expectation point of view, our end users these days want to get right involved with us as we build those systems.
You
And
know, we're starting to use words. I agree with you. I agree with you totally. But we're starting to use some words here that I think we're going to have to define, because we want to start looking at these things. You've used the word complexity, and you've also used the word ambiguity. Can we define the two? Or can we attempt to?
yeah, let me do it from a practical aspect. This is how me looking into a project from my experience. Uncertainty is I just don't know, or I just don't understand. Probably I'm not aware yet. So it's like the unknown. Ambiguity can be fixed, but typically ambiguity, in my experience, has been with my customer base, where people disagreed on what they wanted in the system, and so they were unable to truly give us their requirements in a concrete fashion that we could follow through on. So not that we never got there, we did, but it took more work to get rid of the ambiguity. Uncertainty, no one was really aware of. Now, complexity, that's another thing. Complexity really comes to dealing with difficulty in managing projects. And those can come from a system, they can come from the requirements, they can come from interfacing with other departments, they can come from human behavior.
Mhm. So I see complexity as pieces that connect in so many ways that I cannot predict. If something happens, I can't predict what the actual cause is. It's the way the components interact that don't give me visibility into the function of the system. That's how I see complexity, and that's where the uncertainty arises.
And I think when you said you don't know where the actual cause is, I think you also are in those situations not sure of what the unintended consequences may be as well. So it's both from the source and from the result. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
complexity can get, and I think part of this is we humans create our own complexity.
Yes, we do. We throw too many things on the table at one time, and we get confused. It's the difference between selecting between 3 flavors of ice cream and selecting 31 flavors of ice cream, one from those. And the selection of one from 31 flavors is a more complex problem than just selecting one from 3.
Yes, there's nothing more frustrating than standing in the ice cream line with the people ahead of you, fingers on chin, wondering what they're going to order.
Now, the difference between ambiguity and uncertainty is interesting. When I look at ambiguity, it's where the meaning is not clear or
Right.
misunderstood. I cannot read it. I cannot perceive it. It may not be confusing, but I can't really interpret it or understand it myself. Now, uncertainty is different. That's where I have that's where I have something, I may have identified it or not, but there's a less than 100% probability of it occurring. It doesn't have that components of perception that ambiguity has.
Well, there's an unpredictability to uncertainty, right? That's really what it is. It's
Right.
unpredictable.
And the thing is, yeah, and whether it's in my perceptions or not. Yeah.
And I saw a definition, I think, in the PIN block that talked about a lack of understanding. I think it's more a lack of awareness than a lack of understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I think we'd need to go to another level of definitions to parse this out, but this gives us an understanding of how we're going to use these
Yeah.
words, okay?
So the
So,
example, and I was going to say, just to finish off with the ambiguity, the examples that came to my mind when you asked that question originally, from my practical experience, I've been in situations where two senior managers on the customer side had totally different interpretations of what they were looking at. So that provided us as the vendor with an ambiguous situation as to how to
yes.
get through this. I've been in situations where the terminology that the customer was using was foreign to us. And so a lot of terms they were throwing at us were ambiguous. So we had to spend extra time truly understanding their terminology before we could get down to work. So those are the kinds of situations where it's not that they were uncertain necessarily, but they were certainly, that's weird. They were certainly ambiguous to us.
Yeah. An example of uncertainty compared to ambiguity is having the governor's office call my state agency and me having a conversation with them. And they say, you have 24 hours to change the primary key on all your database away from government numbers, Social Security numbers in the United States, right? How are you going to do it? Well, that's not ambiguous.
That's not ambiguous. No, that is
but
not ambiguous.
but that is uncertain because I don't know how it's going to do it, and I don't know what the impact is. So
Right.
I have to treat the uncertainty maybe a little different from the ambiguity.
So if we've separated those two concepts, uncertainty and ambiguity, complexity has a role in both of those. And I think that's part of the whole domain knowledge, right? The whole domain conversation.
Right.
So how does that fit? How does complexity fit in with those two terms?
There are too many pieces on the board, and they're connecting in too many ways such that they're creating that unpredictability, both ambiguity and uncertainty,
Sure.
because they create an opportunity for people to see them in different ways. And also, it's very hard to assess that this is exactly going to happen if this circuit with 5,000 pieces opens in that manner. It's almost impossible to say what is going to be the result of that entire circuit.
Yeah. The jobs that I've worked on, the projects that I've worked on were always software projects. I didn't work on any hardware or telecommunications. But in those software projects, I can tell you this, and I can tell you this with some pride. The teams that I worked with welcomed complexity because it was a problem-solving opportunity, but we never shied away from it. We didn't care how much uncertainty there was due to complexity. We dove in and solved the problems. And I think what had happened was over time, we had built adaptability and resilience into our corporate project culture such that we welcomed complexity. So that was the juice that flowed whenever we took on a new project. It was just a lot of fun.
And you know what else? Early in my consulting career, the executives and the trainers, the experts in how to work as a group in group management, said, here's how you get rid of ambiguity. We're going to use debate. We're going to use negotiation. We're going to use consensus. And consensus says, even if you don't agree with the result, you're going to agree with supporting the team. And that got rid of the ambiguity and not necessarily the uncertainty. And so moving complexity and ambiguity off the table in the manners you and I described allow us to focus on uncertainty itself.
Well, that allowed you to get your whole team marching in the same direction.
Right.
As a result of that, then yeah, then there is no ambiguity. You all know exactly what your roles are and what the goal of the project is.
Right. Uncertainty or not.
Yeah. Yeah, whenever we dealt with ambiguity, you had mentioned source earlier. We looked at certain situations. For example, if we had a policy situation that was being interpreted to us in ambiguous ways, we would end up going to the source. And sometimes it was federal legislation we would go to and get them to explain it to us and the customer at the same time. So we
Right.
removed the ambiguity because we went all the way back to the source.
That's
Um,
right.
there was times when we had solution ambiguity, meaning there's a few ways to go about getting this done. And so in those situations, we would brainstorm options, and sometimes we would even prototype situations, because that way you're not doing the whole project, but you're doing proofs of concept so that you could understand the better way to go. So that removed the ambiguity when you saw how your model worked. So yeah, there's ways of dealing with this, no matter how complex it is.
This is the interesting thing. And we're coming back to human behavior once again. Right?
Always.
We're always coming back to it. If we create the domain of uncertainty with aspects of complexity and ambiguity, we can take our understanding of human behavior and minimize that so that we're focusing on some functional components that we have a reasonable way of at least wrapping our arms around it as a group.
There is. The challenge here though is estimating, right? Estimating the probability, estimating the impact of that complexity.
See, that's where I come from, and that's one of the questions my students always ask me. Tim, how do you come up with a 45% or a 65 or an 85%? And that's the probability. And what about the impact? Where do you come up with those numbers? What's a good source of those numbers for you?
Well, again, I go back to my experience in terms of the domains that we worked in, the functional domains. And we based a lot of our estimation based on past projects, based on lessons learned, based on knowledgeable experts. If we didn't have the experts, we would bring them in. So because we were putting so much at risk with every bid, we had to have our feet firmly planted in those probability estimates. So a lot of that was based in our homework, lessons learned, um, all of the things that we had prepared beforehand to do.
Now, there's another source that I relied on, and one of my first managers when I was in consulting was incredibly good at this. It's called the central limit theorem and the normal distribution, the bell curve, basically.
Yeah.
And if we were totally outside of our domain, we couldn't understand everything. We always started with, okay, what do numbers look like in purity? In nature, what do numbers look like, right? First of all, we have a coin flip, 50-50. Again, this is an assumption. This is not an estimate, but it's a beginning point that we can look at. And then within that, can we look at variability? Can we look at things where a process or what we're building, can we look at a range? And this is why in estimation we look at uh, optimistic and pessimistic. We're bounding our focus, which gives us an opportunity to see how much variation is there. And when things go across the variation very quickly, we call that volatility. And we can get even deeper into statistics and look at how we can talk about that even before we have work history.
Well, and that gets you close. But here's another interesting thing. I could do the exact same project in this, let's say this, I'll take the state of New York as an example, and do that exact same project, let's say in the state of, oh, I'll say one of the Louisiana. I'll take that same project and do it in the state of Hawaii. Now, I may have the same vendor staff doing all three projects, but I have different customer bases now working with me who culturally are different from one another and possibly from us. So the human factors can absolutely play on those probabilistic theorems in ways that we wouldn't expect. Back to what you said about Agile, some of those situations that you just described, you could go in completely blind, not knowing what's going to happen. And so I think the Agile process allows you in those very quick sprints to try different things such that you can arrive at a solution more quickly.
See, and that allowed you to give you your bounds.
Mm-hmm.
Your early experiments are not going to be on target. They're going to be your mistakes. And they create your extremes of really good performance and really poor performance, a bunch of defects and very few defects. And then you can quickly come to either an optimal or a level of performance that are very easy to understand, experience, and communicate.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I could not help thinking back to when JFK instructed NASA to put a man on the moon. They didn't have the tools that we had, maybe not even the sophisticated processes that we have today. And talk about uncertainty. There was no ambiguity, but there certainly was uncertainty.
Oh, yeah.
And risk was, I just thinking of the person sitting in Houston with your part in that experiment, I guess, at that point. How would you feel if it didn't work, right? I
You,
mean,
a great a great example of this um, is Apollo 13. This was post JFK. They NASA was not implementing Agile yet. It was not Agile. But if you look at the story of Apollo 13 and what was going on, basically, here you are going to the moon and you get a hole in the space capsule. What are you going to do? And the way they worked together and the stories that came out of it describe the agile culture without defining it. It's a beautiful um, allegory that I use a lot in my classes to talk about.
interesting. So from that perspective, there's no way that they could discover the uncertainty. But how do you go about discovering uncertainty in any project that you're working on? Which, by the way, let me clarify that question. I'm not sure how you discover uncertainty if it's an unknown or an unpredictable event, but I guess because by the time you discover it, it's certainty.
Well, here's the thing. You have to find the boundaries. You have to find the boundaries of where you're certain and where you're not certain, first of all. You have to have some definition of there, and you got to get agreement on that. I know nothing about the ocean. I know everything about the land. So, in order for me to start exploring my uncertainty of the ocean, I have to go at the end of the land. Now, when you study the theory of complex systems, they call this the littoral fringe. That's a geography term of where the land meets the ocean. And what you do is you walk along the beach and you say, a rock, I know what a rock is, throw it away. This thing, it looks like a star. I don't know what that is. And separating your known from your unknown helps you at the very beginning, at the very highest level, to say, if it's unknown, I'm going to assume it's part of my ocean. If it's known, I'm going to assume it's part of my land. And that's effectively what you're doing in early discovery of agile projects, walking along the boundaries between the known and the unknown and sorting things out.
Which goes back to all the way when we started this, and I talked about one of the things that we would do is we spend a lot of time gathering information. And part of that information gathering, by the way, wasn't just facts and functions. It was also interviewing our customer base such that we understood their mindset. Who was
Yes.
going to be cooperative? Who was going to be collaborative? Who was going to be difficult to work with? Who was going to be exacting in their requirements? Those things also went into our ability to estimate and to discover uncertainty. Because sometimes you end up with a personality that, if you weren't expecting it, could cause a rift in the way that the project is moving along.
Exactly. Exactly.
Do
So
you get,
we just have time to start closing up our discussion here. One of the things that I always like to end up with is, if you were to assist somebody just on the journey of project management starting off here, what would you advise them on learning how to work with uncertainty?
number one, don't be afraid of uncertainty. You can't step out the door of your home to go to work in the morning without there being uncertainty as to the route you will be taking and what's going to be meeting you on the way. So don't be afraid of uncertainty. The other thing is, make sure, and we just talked about this a few minutes ago, make sure that your data gathering, your requirements analysis are solid. It's such that you are eliminating every possible factor that would lead to any kind of uncertainty so that you can go in with your eyes wide open.
Yeah.
And I think thirdly, I would just add this: be interested in your customer's functional domain. Become a business acumen expert almost as much as your customer is. And what I'm saying is, don't be an order taker, be an active participant. And by doing so, you'll eliminate an uncertainty just based on the education you give yourself.
Yeah. And finally, to cap this off with those wonderful three foundations, explore risk and risk management, and explore the tools and practice them. Don't just practice them to get a job done, practice them to collect knowledge. And at the end of your project, or even if you're doing work around the home with your estimation, look back and say, I really got this thing right. How did I nail the chance of this happening? And looking at that, and how did I identify this, so that you can figure out what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong with your management of these things that might or might not happen.
Yeah, no matter what, you've probably seen a situation like that before. Even if you weren't managing the project, you might have seen how the situation was being managed by your previous project manager. Learn from
Yeah.
those situations. Absolutely.
Yeah. And when it comes to things like COVID, and for things like force majeure acts of nature, God, just understand we're all in the dark. And we've been in the dark for generations and generations under certain things. And either there's history we can rely on, or there are manners that we can approach risk, like the littoral fringe, that we can do it in a way that allows us to keep moving forward, even though we don't know.
Well, in both parties, both the vendor or both the IT provider and the customer or the end user are both interested in having a successful project.
Yeah.
So by understanding that, you can work together to eliminate the uncertainty.
Exactly. Exactly. We're back to human behavior, aren't we?
We are.
So this means that we've covered 8 domains.
And,
This means,
12 principles.
and 12 principles. Um, I would advise that you and I for next week talk about, maybe, like I said, putting a capstone on everything that we've discussed and thought about and discovered by walking through the 7th edition of the Body of Knowledge. How does that sound for our next week?
By what's the term in Agile? A retrospective?
That would be perfect.
That would
Let's
be
call
good.
it a retrospective. And so we can expect to take some lessons learned out of what we looked at from these 12 plus 8 discussions that we've had throughout the last year.
And I think we had started off before the principles. We started off with some foundational ones. So yeah, we've got a lot to talk about to complete our summary of what we discussed for season 3.
I'm looking forward to it.
Great. All right. Until next week.
Thanks again, Merv, and thanks everybody for checking in. We'll talk to you soon.